Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take our first look at some basic flow control in the C programming language. And specifically, we're going to take a look at the syntax for the if statement and specifically the if-else statements in the C programming language. Now, this video assumes a couple of things that you've been working along at least a little bit with fundamentals demo or some equivalent project and have been able to get it compiling to the command line as well as running it from the command line. And we're going to spend a ton of time running this particular series from the command line. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to focus more on the syntax and how to go about writing effective if statements in the C programming language. This video also assumes that you've managed to obtain a copy of the if statements snips file that you see I have up in NetBeans on the right side of my screen. Basically, it just contains a function prototype as well as a stubbed-in function, mainly with comments that will sort of explain to us what we're going to be doing in this particular example. And again, this is part of a larger series of videos, so I encourage you to follow along not only with this video, but also with some of the videos that follow. So to begin with, let's go ahead and get into the habit of simply copying our function prototype and pasting it over here in our fundamentals driver.c. Doesn't really matter too much exactly where you end up putting it. I'm just going to keep these grouped together as we go through these if statements. And then also go ahead and copy over the comment block as well as the function stub that I've created. And I'm simply going to add this then down to the bottom of my C source file. And at this point, then you can either close the snips file or you can minimize it, whichever you'd like to go about doing it. Now, I like to get into the habit of simply just building a file or building my project whenever I add code to a file. That's always a promising result right there. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing you're going to notice with this particular example and with some of the subsequent examples is that I'm using a void input argument and a void return argument. That just simply means that everything we do is going to be contained inside this function. So the idea is that this is just going to help us with understanding the if statement and only that inside of this function. So let's go ahead and start off with looking at the basic syntax for an if statement. The idea is that an if statement will allow for you to evaluate a condition, an expression. Sometimes I like to explain to students that it is a question, if you would, that the code is asking. Perhaps it's inquiring about the value of a variable, the state of a variable, and so on. And then basically, if the condition evaluates to true, in other words, let's say the value for the variable a is equal to 5, and that's the condition that you're testing. Well, if that condition is true, then, well, you simply run this statement of code. And if this condition results in a false, well, then you simply run the else branch. Now, this is, again, the very basic example here. We're going to actually see many, many more examples. But the one thing that I want to point out, right off the bat, is that you can technically have an if statement and an else statement without any sort of curly braces. And you'll see immediately following this example here that I have provided a second example. And so what we're going to do here is we're actually going to follow this particular pattern. I just sort of want to go ahead and point it out early on because it is very common that you will see code in the C programming language that does not use the curly braces. And I just kind of want to point it out to you that there is no harm in simply including it. The biggest advantage, or actually the reason that you would include it, is in case you have multiple lines of code that you wish to run. So in other words, between these two examples right here, the only thing that's really different is that in the first example, you have a single statement that you wish to run under the if true branch or under the else, which is essentially the false branch. Whereas down here in this example with the curly braces, if you'll notice how it's highlighted, that basically it allows for you to run a block of code or multiple lines of code. Again, how the condition is evaluated doesn't really matter. In both cases, if the condition is true, the first block is ran, and if the condition is false, the second block is ran. Short story, I encourage you just to go ahead and use the curly braces whenever you are working with if-else blocks. So let's go ahead and get started with an example. And again, that's kind of the goal with this series of videos, is just one example after another after another. And some of these examples are going to feel a little contrived, and this one in particular is going to have to be pretty simple just so we can see how the syntax works. The idea is I want to query the user for what the temperature is outside, and we're just going to return one of two options for the user to pick as far as the clothing that they will wear. And you're going to see real quick that this is probably almost too simple of an example. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and declare a variable that I'm going to call temperature. And you want to remember to go ahead and initialize the variable. Even though we are going to be using a scanf in just a second to prompt the user. And of course, it does help if you actually spell your variables consistently. And then what we'll do is we'll follow this up with a print statement that says, please enter the current temperature, followed by a new line and a semicolon at the end. And then we will then use a scanf to collect this information from the user using a %d, that's the format specifier, for a integer. And then, of course, you remember that you have to pass the variable's address. In this case, it's going to be the address of the temperature variable. Again, you should probably get into the habit of using the control in the spacebar and NetBeans or whatever your IDE is to autocomplete the variable. And at this point, we have been able to successfully get information from the user, store it into a variable, and hence you see that level of unpredictability. In other words, the idea here is now, depending on what the user enters in as the temperature, we want to give them a recommendation for a piece of clothing. In other words, we wouldn't have known this necessarily at design time. In other words, we have to figure it out at runtime, and hence the reason to prompt the user for the information. So what we'll do is we'll use some very simple inequalities here to test the value, and we're going to check to see if the temperature is above a certain value. And since it's a nice day today, I'm going to assume that the temperature is above 60 degrees, or I tell you what, let's go ahead and make it 70 degrees for this particular example. And we've got a number of possibilities there. We could do greater than, equal to, and so on. All of the operators that you would normally expect to be able to use whenever you're doing an algebraic comparison like we are here. And then under the else block, well, basically, if this condition is true, the temperature is going to be 70 degrees, or rather greater than 70 degrees. And the else block is going to be 70 degrees or less. And again, you can see here where this is very coarse. There's not a lot of refinement here. We're just going to check one condition. At this point, what I'd like to do is simply follow it up with a print statement and say something along the lines of, please wear shorts, followed by a new line. And then under the else, well, again, not a lot of refinement here. Please wear a jacket, meaning that those are really our only two options, which probably brings us to the point that you shouldn't let C determine what type of clothing you're going to wear on a given day. At this point, this should functionally work. As a matter of fact, I would encourage for you to go ahead and build this. Just saw I have another typo here in my prompt to the user. No big deal. Let's go ahead and build this. And what you want to do is then you want to drive it from your main to see how this works. But again, before we leave this particular example, the idea here is that we're going to prompt the user for some information, collect it, store it into this variable, or rather store it at the address of this variable, and then evaluate it conditionally to determine then what is printed to the command line or to the console. So let's go ahead and work our way through this one. You'll notice that from a previous example here, I have to comment out my other functions. And then what I would like to do here is I would simply like to make a call to my if statements _01. Again, I'm going to go ahead and build it. And what I can do now is I can come out to my command window, cd to the correct directory, just a second here, users, there we go, G. Myers, documents, courses, E233, projects, and then finally into my fundamentals demo. And then we can see here, there's all the files that I showed you in a previous video. We can go ahead and cd into our distribution folder, into our debug, and into our MinGW. And you can see there is our fundamentals demo.exe. And if we run it, it's going to ask us to please enter the current temperature. I'm going to go ahead and put in 75. And it's now telling us to wear shorts. Whereas if I put in a value lower than 70, please wear a jacket. Now, I realize this example is very basic, very simple, but hopefully you now can see the structure of the if statement in the C programming language. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.